So it's not very often that we get to hold an author talk for the deputy general counsel of a newspaper. In fact, I don't know of any precedent for this. But David McCraw is not just any deputy general counsel. He's the newsroom lawyer for the New York Times, where he's worked for a decade and a half now. That means he gets to do a lot of interesting and stressful things. He gets to defend the Times against actual and threatened suits, advise reporters on sensitive stories, file suits seeking government documents hidden from view, and work for the release of journalists kidnapped by extremists or detained by hostile governments. As David says in the first chapter of his book, Truth in Our Times, it's been a hell of a time to be a lawyer for the New York Times. David gained some notoriety himself back in the fall of 2016 in the waning days of the presidential campaign. The Times had published an article about two women who said Trump had groped them. A lawyer for Trump demanded a retraction and threatened to sue for libel. David responded with a letter that suggested Trump's reputation regarding the treatment of women was so tarnished by things he'd previously said and done that it couldn't really be tarnished more. And further, David asserted the article contained newsworthy information and was within the law. Then David added this, quote, "If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who would dare to criticize him to stand silent or be punished, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight." Now, David doesn't usually write such pointed legal letters inviting others to sue the New York Times. He tends, in his own words, to be a little more down the middle, a little more accommodating. But he made a decision, as he says, to stand tall on this one, given what was at stake. And when his letter was published online, it went viral and many applauded. In his book, David recounts what it's been like providing legal advice to the Times for its coverage of Trump, Harvey Weinstein, and other subjects. But the book isn't just a behind-the-scenes look at a great newspaper. It's also a passionate argument for preserving press freedom during these turbulent times, times when the president himself no longer merely threatens to sue, but aims to erode the First Amendment and to delegitimize the media by labeling them fake and enemies of the people. David will be in conversation with Michael Schmidt, who started as a news clerk at the New York Times 14 years ago and now covers federal investigations, principally these days the Mueller investigation. Michael was part of two New York Times teams that won Pulitzer Prizes last year, one for reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues, and the other for coverage of Trump and his campaign ties to Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David McCraw and Michael Schmidt.
Thanks for having us. It's great to have you here.
We have known each other forever, and I know so much stuff about him. He is not going to ask any hard questions. I would have brought a style writer had I needed this.
We've been through a lot together.
That's true.
I always need a good lawyer, I guess. Before we get into the stuff about the book, can you explain to us what does a general counsel do for a newsroom? What is your actual job? What do you really do here?
It is a real job. I mean, you make it sound... Okay, now the first thing I have to do is I am the deputy general counsel. So my most important role is to correct the misimpression I am the general counsel. That's to allow me to go back to work on Monday. I have a wonderful general counsel, Diane Braden, who keeps me out of trouble. My role is essentially to be the chief newsroom lawyer for the New York Times. And that includes everything from suing the government over freedom of information issues or vetting stories in advance of publication. A lot of times I'm answering a lot of questions about what can reporters do to get a story. Sometimes I get some copyright questions. All of those things are part of it. Through strange history, I also am deeply involved with our international security operation, as you know. That started when I became, for whatever reason, the person in charge of our response to the kidnapping of David Rode in 2008.
So basically, like how our journalists in foreign countries in danger zones are protected, you're in charge of that as well.
Yeah, as you know, we have an outstanding security advisor, Tug Wilson. He and I work together. He's the one who does the work. I make sure that he's available by phone all the time, 24/7.
So you think that we're at this critical point right now with Trump because of, the media is at a critical point because of Trump. But you think that it's a sort of a different issue than what you may have thought it was going to be initially. The legal structure that we have is really protected the media, but it's something else, which we'll get to after you answer this, that has really become the problem. What is it? Why is the current legal structure very sound, you think, for journalists?
Beginning in 1964, when the Supreme Court decided Times versus Sullivan, it was a march of press freedom at the Supreme Court over the next 25 years, over and over again, with the exception of protection of sources. The cases came one after another, expanding press freedom, and all of that is still there, and it has been proven again and again over time. Times versus Sullivan really was one of those Supreme Court decisions, despite what Clarence Thomas says, that got it right. And it got it right because it understood that libel suits are usually not about anybody's reputation. They are about silencing speech that somebody doesn't like. They are used as weapons. That's what was going on in 1964. Sullivan was a police commissioner in Alabama. He and many others were suing the Northern press because those office holders in Alabama didn't want the Northern press to come down and talk about the civil rights movements. They did not want the Northern press to come down and talk about Jim Crow laws. These suits were the way they were stopping that from happening. $500,000 verdict against the New York Times in Alabama courts in the Sullivan case, even though he's not mentioned at all in the piece that was being challenged. Here's the thing that I find so interesting. Yesterday, President Trump lost an appeal in a libel suit where he is being sued, okay? He is being sued for what he said on Twitter. He's going to have to face trial in all likelihood, or at least go through the process at the trial court. He should be embraced. He should be lining up on the other side of the ball. He should be with us because he's going to be using exactly the same defenses I do. And they're really good defenses because they encourage free speech.
So in our coverage, we don't face the threat, despite that we're told all the time that we're going to get sued, especially by the president. You don't think we face a real threat from that?
There's a range of things that threaten us, but in terms of libel, I feel very confident. Now, you know, because you've read the book is a tribute to misplaced optimism. Over and over again, I say things are going to be fine, and they aren't fine, okay? So I'm going to say they're fine, and they can all take that for what it's worth.
But legally, they're fine, but what do you think is the real issue?
Well, let me walk up to that a little bit, Mike, which is that the Trump administration's attack on the press is just a cocktail of bad ideas and bullying, okay? That's what it is. And we could look at the leak investigations. That's a problem. We could look at his ranting about we should change the libel laws, okay? We can look at how press conferences have become reality TV and they're going to do Survivor and vote CNN off the island or something, whatever. But when it comes down to, I really think the thing that concerns me is this whole business about fake news, stain on society, enemy of the people. And here's why I think that's a problem. It is an attempt to discredit, and in many ways, a press that's shackled, like we see in other countries, is not that different from a press that's not believed. The only power of the press is to reach people, motivate public opinion, get people to be a check on their own governments and change things that they want changed. That's not going to happen if the press isn't believed. There was a poll last year that found 26% of the respondents think that the president should be allowed to shut down news organizations if, quote, they misbehave. When I see a number like that, we have obviously driven off the road.
So that's not a legal problem, but what's the answer?
Well, let me diagnose the problem one more step, and then I'll talk about what will be a very unsatisfying answer. And while I do that, it'll give me a chance to try to think of an answer. Look, here's the problem with the label of fake news. There's an evil genius to that from a sloganeering standpoint, right? Because it sounds like the pursuit of truth, right? I'm against fake news. That sounds like the pursuit of truth. When in fact, it's just the opposite. What it is an attempt to get people not to think. Label and dismiss, label and dismiss. The press should be criticized. We should have a debate over whether the story is true or false. We should have a debate over whether it's fair or unfair. It's just labeling something fake news is the circumvention of that important process in democracy. So what's to be done? And Mike is right, because I keep blaming you. I keep blaming the public. It's up to the public to do something about it. Here's what I think. We don't need to get 100% of the people to believe in a free press. And we don't start at zero. There's a lot of folks who believe in the free press. So I do think that people need to stand up and talk about the issues I talk about in the book, talk about why having a free press is important, and it's particularly important for Republicans to do that, to stand up and say, look, I may not like the New York Times, or I may not like the Washington Post, I may love Fox, but you know what? I have to throw that in there every once in a while. But I believe that having a free press is important. I grew up in a very small town in Illinois. My mother was a World War II veteran. My father was a World War II veteran. They were deeply patriotic. When you grow up in Illinois in the 1960s and 1970s, as I did, in a conservative, small farm town, the one thing you knew was the governor goes to jail. Because when I was a kid, the governor went to jail. Otto Kerner went to jail. Dan Walker went to jail. The Secretary of State, he died before he could go to jail, but when he died, they found shoeboxes full of money in his office, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The lesson of that was a really important conservative lesson: don't trust government. And that's why it's so important to get back to that and have people across the political spectrum. I think, I started this in 2016. It hasn't happened, but I actually was saying, somebody from whoever's my equivalent of Breitbart News should go out and debate. We should go around the country and talk about why this is important. That hasn't happened.
Besides the president using the megaphone of the bully pulpit to come after the press, what other things have happened that contributed to the current state of the media? How did we get here?
Well, we could talk about this at various levels. Part of it is that the polarization of America is now reflected in the press. So people are dividing up, and I think that's a bad development. And I think that for those of us at the New York Times, continuing to press to be an honest broker is really important, as much as the right wing wants to portray us as left wing, as much as the left wing may want to embrace us at this particular moment. We'll see what happens after we run some stories about the Democratic candidates. That being an honest broker is where we want to end up. So the polarization has been a problem. The economics have been a problem. Let's face it, if you live outside of Washington, if you live outside of New York, if you live outside of certain big cities, your newspaper is in dire straits and it's not coming back. If you are a mayor in a small city, you are a very happy person today because nobody's watching, okay? You can have your shoebox full of money and nobody's going to catch that. We've all been affected by it, though, wherever we are in the market, and that has meant that we have had to do things to make money and to drive audience. And it's very important, and I think we do a good job of this, of understanding that we still have to do journalism that people need, not just journalism that people want. To some extent, I just think that Donald Trump's political instincts about these things have been incredible, that attacking the press works and for a big part of his base.
So this issue was sitting there to be taken advantage of, is what you're saying? To some extent.
It was. And I'm sure that Richard Nixon, I guess you can't say looking down from heaven. Anyway, Richard Nixon's probably, Richard Nixon come back and say, I wish I had tried that. Why didn't I? Richard Nixon thought that you had to, like in public at least, say the First Amendment's important and I believe in a free press. And, I may not like what they're saying and he may say it differently in private, but somehow it has become permissible to do that.
Are you saying that Nixon may have had a different political fortune if he had existed in today's media landscape?
Man, he is not very charismatic, is he? I don't know. That's a good question. But he certainly could have made it much more of an issue, that when he confronts Dan Rather, some of you will be old enough to remember this, Dan Rather stands up and gets an applause. And Nixon says, "Are you running for something, Mr. Rather?" And he responds, "No, are you?" Bad, and he was criticized. I mean, he was really lacerated for that. But that kind of direct hostility was not seen as the game.
In the book, you seem confident in the structure that has emerged, this sort of legal structure that protects us from libel, that allows us to function and do the work we do. But how do you think that we are faring in terms of the reporters in the Washington Bureau? We're out there doing a lot of source reporting. How do you think we are protected in the current atmosphere?
Well, that's why when you talk about press freedom, you have to talk about categories of things. One's libel. I feel pretty good about that. I'm optimistic. I don't think that optimism is misplaced for once. I sort of come across as Hubert Humphrey here, and look how well it worked out for him, the happy warrior, President Humphrey. Okay. When you get to what are the informal things that are going on, the law doesn't have much to say about that. CNN, as you know, sued about the exclusion of Jim Acosta, and I think most people in media law wondered whether that was a good idea. There had been the earlier incident with Sean Spicer where going to divide the press corps and take some into a press conference and exclude others. And I talk about in the book how the law is very, very gray on this, whether an office holder can do that, choose who to talk to and who not to talk to. And in the main, the cases have said, look, just because you're a political office holder doesn't mean you lose your First Amendment rights. You're not forced to talk to people. So there are a lot of norms that come into play here. Who travels with the Secretary of State? Press corps, or are they left behind? Who gets called on in press conferences? All that kind of stuff. So that area, I think, has been really tough, and the attack on the democratic norms have been a real problem as a result. You then get to what I think are the sensitive legal issues because they're undecided, and that is the publication of classified secrets. And that comes in two flavors. The legal problems come in two flavors. One is, can you protect your source? The law on the federal side is in disarray, and it makes me nervous. We need to protect sources, and the law hasn't kept up with us. The other thing is, it would be an absolute legal revolution if it took place, and would be an incredible fight, and that is, can a reporter actually be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for publishing classified information? 101 years, 102 years, the Espionage Act has been around. It's never happened. It's never happened. No administration has ever said, I want to push that. I want to push to see whether that law is overcome by the First Amendment, or whether it is in fact superior to the First Amendment, and we can go after reporters. This isn't any administration.
Despite the bluster of the president on this issue, what have you seen from the Justice Department legally in terms of going after reporters?
It's been a bit of a mixed bag, I think. That Jeff Sessions, who was relevant at the time I was writing the book, that's the problem about writing about it. You must know this. Like, everybody changes. Who's Jeff Sessions? Oh, yeah, 3 guys ago. Okay, got that. Anyway, and Jeff Sessions, he went to Congress and they went to Senate, and Klobuchar was all over him, getting him to say, I will not put journalists in jail for doing their job. And he couldn't get those words out of his mouth. I don't know what was going on there. It was really not a reassuring day. And then came back and did the same performance later. So there certainly is a different attitude. Now, we have not seen a real ramp up in anything other than leak investigations, which were already ramped up. And they have not been targeting the press. They haven't been calling the press as witnesses. They haven't been forcing people in these past 8-9 years to expose sources or try to get a reporter to expose sources, but they have been going after the people inside government. And this is kind of the same story as libel. Libel's not really about protection of reputation. It's about weaponizing lawsuits to silence. Leak investigations, in the main, are not really about protecting national security secrets. They're about getting the message under control and having the government control that message. Leakers, uncomfortable subject for me. I'm a rules guy. I'm a lawyer. But they're really important. Even when those government employees are violating the law to talk to us, it's important in a democracy.
Do you think the Justice Department should not prosecute cases in which really sensitive national security information comes out? If you like, the government would say, well, how are we supposed to operate as a government if people just go out and dump information?
This is why I should have brought a Styles reporter. Okay. No. I mean, obviously there are legitimate secrets. There are legitimate secrets, and there are secrets that if they are exposed, they would do harm. And it's one of the things that I'm really proud of, the way you guys work in Washington, the way Dean Baquet and the editors in New York work. Nobody is doing a reckless job of publishing. They're thinking about it. We ask the government to give their opinion. They don't get a veto, but we want to know what they think. Many times the editors choose to ignore. But yeah, they're legitimate secrets. But what's interesting is you go back to the Pentagon Papers and read it, 1971, that incredible decision, because Justice Potter Stewart says, if everything is classified, nothing is classified. And if you overclassify, you get two results, cynicism and carelessness. And that's the exact opposite of what you want. And nobody's paid attention to him. The overclassification is rampant. And so sometimes it's very hard to understand what is classified. Lawyers for the people who are being investigated will call me and say, can't you get the reporter to say that no classified information was leaked? And so I'll talk to the reporter, and it's not. I can't say that because it's not true.
Tell us the story of what happened in October of 2016 and how you got to the unusual place of sort of becoming part of the story.
Yeah, that wasn't very comfortable. So I'm going to back up one step and talk about the tax returns and then go to the letter, because I think they sort of travel in tandem as to how the Trump campaign was dealing with this. At the end of September of 2016, Sue Craig, a reporter at the New York Times, receives in the mail anonymously 3 pages from the Trump tax returns from 2 decades earlier. She and David Barstow and others do this incredible job of A, authenticating those tax returns, and B, explaining what it meant, which was that Trump probably paid no taxes for the next 20 years. And we ran that story, and immediately there was press coverage that said that we were in legal trouble.
Which really irritated you.
Completely irritated me, especially when it was the editor of the New York Times saying it.
But tell that part of the story.
Yeah, well, okay, so yeah. He brought this up the other day. I think it's a sensitive topic. So anyway, shortly before that, if we can continue backwards here, in September, the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, had been at Harvard. He was on a panel with Bob Woodward and Laura Poitras, and the conversation sort of runs out of control. And it's a little hard to tell who said what, but the way it gets reported is that Dean Baquet said that he would risk going to jail even in contravention of his lawyer's advice. And I started receiving emails like, "You really think you couldn't print the tax returns if you got them?" And I go, "No, I do think that." But in a bad moment, it was early, I sent Dean an email, maybe 2, saying like, this is embarrassing. I would never tell you not to publish those. I would, of course, stand behind you. And he clarified that he hadn't said it. And if you listen to tape, I think that is right, because it's just
So basically, Dean is saying, like, I would go to jail to publish these tax returns. You're saying, as the lawyer, I would say you have no legal issue, just publish the tax returns.
That's right. You're not going to go to jail. Think in your history, as you think back, when's the last time you've seen an editor going to jail? That's just for publishing something. That just doesn't happen.
Because tax documents are no different than the other documents.
Right. If they're leaked, under the law, if they're leaked to us and we have not engaged in any illegality to get them, we can publish them. That's how that works. That's the great thing about the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has ruled on that 6 times. And the question is, did the press do anything illegal to get them? If you're just the passive recipient, you're in good shape. But the idea that the Washington Post would come out the day after we ran that tax story and say we had risked legal trouble really got me thinking that we had done a very bad job of explaining how the First Amendment works in this country. But it obviously was a sensitive issue, and with the Trump administration, as we move forward, then we do a story a couple weeks later about 2 women who said they'd been groped many years earlier, and by Trump. And I thought it was a great story because it did what I think a story should do. It gave the facts of our reporting. It left readers to think about, well, am I going to believe this or not? We believe that those women were credible, but the facts were there if you wanted to question that decision. The night before we published the Trump campaign, thank you. Man, there was a time when you could say it. Yeah, there was. Right, okay. It seems like these last 2 years have been my entire life. Okay, so the Trump campaign was saying that they would sue if we published. We published. Then there ensues in a whole day when they're saying, the lawyers are getting geared up, the lawyers are going to come after you, And late into the night, I'm getting emails from the PR department saying, have you seen anything? Have you seen anything? And I said, look, you have to go to court before you can serve us with papers, and unless they're going to Bronx criminal court, it ain't going to happen, okay? But
that'd be the only court that was open.
That's the only court open that night, and boy, they see some weird stuff there, but not suits by presidential candidates. So, but then I received, when I woke up the next morning, there was an email from Dean Baquet, our editor, that said, it was labeled After Midnight. It's a J.J. Cale song, everybody. I know that. Okay. I was in a lot of trouble with a lot of music fans when I said it was an Eric Clapton song. It's a J.J. Cale song. It says, that here's the letter from the lawyers. So I went to work, wrote the letter. There was some discussion about whether we should respond at all, because they had put theirs on the web, and there were TV crews outside the building. I didn't think we could just ignore it, so we decided to respond to it. And the letter, which it appears on the back of the book, but also has been in a lot of places, suddenly just takes off. And it is a moment where, while I am out front in some ways, not quite like that.
Would a younger version of yourself looked at that and said maybe a lawyer shouldn't be so involved like that, or was it unusual? Was it unusual for a lawyer to be so much part of a story?
In some ways, the legal department at a newspaper should be out front, because you guys should not be engaged in the back and forth over the legalities of stories and all that sort of stuff, and are talking about the importance of a free press. It's really a function that can confuse the lines between independent reporting and our interests as a company and our interest in the First Amendment. So to that extent, it did not seem out of place for me to do that. I think it was the level of attention that was different, and sort of the personalization of it around me. And only in retrospect, as you know from the book, did I wonder whether maybe this was a really smart idea, because a couple of the other senior lawyers in the department, the general counsel and then deputy general counsel, and I and one of our younger lawyers sat around and talked about the letter. But that was really the deciding group. 4 lawyers in a room, door closed, and we're playing with the language, and we're trying this sentence and that sentence. But we ultimately decided to go back to the original one, and I think everybody was on board with that after we'd worked at it. And I'm sitting in my office, the thing's gone up on the internet, and my phone is ringing, and the emails are starting to come in, and they're just coming and coming and coming. And I look up, and there's the CEO of our company coming towards me. I have a glass office. That's a bad thing at a time like this. And because I could tell he had the letter in one hand. And, he had that look on his face. And you sort of are thinking like, well, maybe we should have run this by senior management. Maybe that would have been okay to do that before we sent it, right? And he comes in. He's an Englishman, Mark Thompson. And he said, this is a brilliant letter, but I will never understand why you Americans capitalize after a colon. I'm here to tell you this is one American who no longer capitalizes after a colon, because that could have gone so much worse.
In the book, you tell a story about the difficulties of the work that we do and of how, really awful things can happen even when we have the best intentions. There's a story about a hostage in 2014. Can tell us that story.
Yeah, this is a tough story, but Theo Curtis was a freelance journalist who was taken by Al-Qaeda in Syria, where he was, like many reporters in those days, crossing over from Turkey to try to cover the rebellion in Syria, and Theo was taken captive. He was held by the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria with another American, and the two of them at some point end up putting together an escape plot. And Matt Schreier, the other American, in fact, does escape with Theo's help. Because of circumstances, and they're in the book, and Matt Schreier's written a book, and Theo's written a book, so all of this is out there. But Matt gets away, and Theo doesn't. We do a story about Matt's experience, which was kind of incredible. He was a freelance photographer. He is held by these terrorists, gets away, and manages to get back to the United States. We do an interview with him, and I was sent the story, and for whatever reason, I missed one piece of it as I was reading it too fast, which was it mentions that he was assisted by another prisoner. And as a result of that, I am fairly confident that Theo Curtis, who received very bad treatment after that it was in some way related to the fact the New York Times and CNN had talked to Matt and raised that. It was really painful because Theo's mother had reached out to me, and we had been helping the family through our people in Turkey and elsewhere in the Middle East to try to help Theo's family get him back. And the only really good news in that story is that ultimately Theo Curtis is released and does come home, and has been completely gracious with me and with the New York Times. But it's one of those things that stays with you that had I been reading with the lights on more, it wouldn't have happened, and I do hold myself responsible for that.
Folks want to line up to ask questions here. Take some questions.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I worked for 1 year in the general counsel's office at the Des Moines Register years and years ago.
My favorite paper.
It's a great paper. It was a great paper.
I was at the Quad City Times, so
oh, really?
Yeah, you cast
good.
a big shadow.
So
they think we're kidding. That's true, isn't it?
No, it's a wonderful paper. Yeah. I think at one time it had won more Pulitzer Prizes than the New York Times.
Won a bunch, yeah.
So I know media lawyers don't like this kind of question, but I'm wondering what legal channels you think there might be to hold to account broadcast outlets like Fox or right-wing outlets that do traffic in fake news. And I'm wondering why there isn't more the possibility of a libel suit where actual malice is demonstrated, or bringing back the fairness doctrine imposed by the FCC, or even a heretofore unthought of tort, like publishing something that is false and showing actual malice, and that is somehow not damaging to an individual reputation, but somehow to the civic good. And again, I know media lawyers don't like thinking
Can
about
we
that.
talk about Iowa? We agree about Iowa. Okay, so we'd be perfect on Iowa. You raise a lot of good points. I actually do, though, disagree with that. There are so many choices out there. I'm not sure the FCC really needs to play the role of the fairness cop anymore. If you want to be a journalist, a publisher, you can be that now. I think it's highly unlikely and a bad idea for mainstream media to bring lawsuits. People always are calling me like, when are you going to sue Trump and all that kind of stuff. We shouldn't be in the business of making the libel laws worse for ourselves. And I still am a firm believer that if we have differences of opinion with the president, the place to do that is on the editorial page and in front of the public. The thing about, but you raise a really good point, which is about falsity, and it's an active debate. There are people on my side of the world who say that this is the place where we should where we should cut back on the First Amendment, because you look at the fake news being planted by the Russians. The Supreme Court in the United States, in a case called United States versus Alvarez, essentially said that the government shouldn't be a truth ministry, that should not be policing lies, that the remedy for lies is the marketplace of ideas. That's even more optimistic and misplaced optimism, even more misplaced optimism than I have. But in the end, I still agree with that.
Even when you can show actual malice and subjective knowledge of falsehood.
But it still has to be directed at somebody. Just
well,
being
I know
false.
that's the current state of the law.
Yeah. And I'm going to have to say I'm okay with that.
Speaking of Iowa, you had an unusual route to becoming a newsroom lawyer. Tell us about how you got there.
Okay, we won't go back to my childhood. We'll pick up the story somewhere. I was a college professor well into my mid-30s, and went to law school when I was 34, 35. I woke up one day and realized that when you're 34 and still living like you were 18, that's probably a problem, especially when you have a child and a wife. And so I went to law school. I had a very sort of straightforward job at a big law firm in New York. And then I, through circumstances, became the newsroom lawyer for the Daily News, which was just an incredible education in journalism. I've been involved. I graduated from journalism school. I taught journalism, really interested in journalism. But it was an incredible education. And the job at the Times opened up because of something that has been very, very good for America, and that is Adam Liptak decided to become a journalist. He's now the Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times. A tremendous reporter. He had my job, and he had decided to try life as a journalist. The job opened up on very short notice. I had been at the Daily News doing the same sort of things that Adam had done. And in particular, what was interesting, though, because I don't have any of the credentials that you would have as a Timesman. I graduated from Albany Law School, very, very loyal to my alma mater, but it is a regional law school. I went to state school, University of Illinois, as an undergraduate. And but there were a group of former Daily News reporters who at that point worked at the Times. It's now 2002, just after the 9/11. And they wanted to sue the city to get the documents from the fire department that showed how the rescue and recovery operation had taken place, because they were hearing from people in the fire department that it had been, for all the heroics, had been a mess, that it had been uncoordinated, disjointed, and so forth. And so when I came to the Times, people were asking me, well, would you sue the city of New York over 9/11 documents? I was from the Daily News. I didn't know any better. Of course I would sue the city. The Daily News was always in the face of the city. That was our role in life. And so I became that Timesman who was willing to do that. And we spent 4 years almost, litigating that, and actually ended up winning a whole lot of documents, which shed a whole lot of light on what happened on 9/11.
Yes. This may be a little bit off of the subject, but along the lines of Fox News. In your opinion, how much, if any, has the underfunded public education system, especially in the red states, helped the rise of popularity of the pseudo news factories like Fox, or do you see it mostly as driven by a backlash against cultural changes and technologies and new platforms that allow it to spread?
So far out of my portfolio. I do think, and when I bring up this point about that the government doesn't have a role, it's up to the people, many people will say, well, you may not have heard this, David, but the government actually runs the schools in this country, so maybe the one point I will make, because I am not really good at political theorizing, but the one point I will make is I had a really interesting reaction. I had been on a television show yesterday, and I got an email from somebody, and it looked like the crazy kind of emails that you must get all the time from well-meaning citizens who aren't, well, anyway. But it was this really nice thing about that, will you write a young author's book? Because, it doesn't do any good to do a book, for adults. Can we start? And I actually, interesting story, my cohort at the Canadian Broadcast Corporation has written a whole series of books in Canada for children on the rights under the Charter in Canada. Somebody should do that here. So, sorry.
Hi, thank you.
Hi there.
The other side of the first question that you had, it would be, what standing does the public have, seeing as an informed electorate is the basis of democracy, for a press that has the freedom to omit big stories that for one reason or another it doesn't cover? A case in point, people right now in the media are so anxious to get something on Trump. Why don't they look at the fact that one of his transition team, Ira Greenstein, while he was in the White House selecting candidates for the Department of the State, was also president of Genie Energy, which has been supposedly by Netanyahu given sole drilling rights in the Golan Heights. So this is obvious conflict of interest where certain American investors would be profiting from this in money, and now you have politicians going and saying we should accept Israel as ruling that. There are huge stories that just don't get any air.
I'm really lucky that I don't have to make those hard decisions about what to cover, but I think it's really important that you know all this, because that means that the system is working in some ways. It's not being hidden.
It's working through those channels that Facebook and Google and the State Department would like to shut down and term as proper, not fake news.
That's why we need the First Amendment, yeah.
Hi, my name is Samuel Breslow. I'm currently at the American Prospect, but I previously interned at the Student Press Law Center, which is an organization that works to support student journalists who are facing legal challenges, often from their administrations. So my question for you, I was wondering whether you have any advice for student journalists or other people who are working in journalism but may not have the sorts of resources that the New York Times has. How can they, make sure that they're able to do good work while not getting in trouble with the law or, navigating all the legal challenges?
Yeah, I spoke last week at the College Media Association's annual convention, and the point I made there is those student journalists who are at private colleges are really courageous because the First Amendment doesn't protect them, and they're doing incredible journalism, and they're taking on administrations that are in the business of selling the institution, and the last thing they want is to have stories that are negative about the institution. So I applaud their work. There is in New York State, elsewhere, a bill that is making its way guaranteeing freedom of expression, freedom of the press for student journalists. Public schools in New York has variations elsewhere. But the thing I would always stress is, and I was a college newspaper advisor for more than a decade at a private college. Learn how to do journalism right, that you will find that enlightened administrations know that if you have a quality newspaper, you're going to take a few hits, but the parents of prospective students and the prospective students know the real deal. Do it right, and you stand in a much better moral position to say, we need our rights to tell the truth.
Thank you.
I wonder how you feel about laws that restrict the speech of enterprises that are not media corporations, such as campaign finance laws that have restricted the ability of business corporations, nonprofit corporations, unions to even mention the name of candidates near elections, which is what the McCain-Feingold law did before it was ultimately struck down by the Citizens United decision. But criminalizing speech about public matters or even references to public officials, which were applied to, vast organizations, business, nonprofit, union, again, but not media corporations.
Yeah.
And how the First Amendment ought to apply there.
Right, and just as I am a misguided optimist, I'm also a misguided simpleton about the First Amendment. I actually think that the government should not be restricting speech. I understand that's led to a very, very dysfunctional system of campaigning. But ultimately, I start with sort of a first principle, which is I don't really want the government regulating speech. Now, within that confines, I'm sure there are people much smarter than I am about that issue that can think of ways to get there.
We've got a real leak.
That is quite little. Yeah. So anyway, I'm thankful that that's not my area of law.
How has the First Amendment evolved politically over the past 25, 30 years? It seems to be in a different place, the left looking at it differently than the right. Like who's more of a champion today of the First Amendment?
It's one of those issues, as I say in the book, that I have always assumed we can find a consensus. That conservatives believe in it because it's anti-big government. The Democrats have traditionally seen it as an important way to expose social injustices and wrongdoing. So I spent a lot of my life thinking that we were all in this together. It's one of the reasons it really appealed to me was I didn't have to have any enemies. And in the book, I go back to what I think is a really, really interesting and crucial moment, and that's 2010. Publishers in this country were facing out-of-control libel judgments overseas, that they would get sued in England and places that didn't respect freedom of the press enough. And the people who were suing were oligarchs and terrorism financiers and big corrupt businessmen. And they were going to London and suing U.S. publishers to try to silence them. And Congress decided to do something about that. And Congress passed the single most important piece of libel litigation it has ever passed, and that is the Speech Act. In simple terms, what the Speech Act says is if you go into a foreign court and you win a libel judgment, you cannot come to this country and enforce against bank accounts and property. In other words, they strip the ability of foreign plaintiffs in libel suits who win to come after money in the United States to satisfy the judgment. Here's the important thing about that, not the law. Here's the important thing. Every Republican and every Democrat in Congress voted for that. It was unanimous. That was only 9 years ago. And I would like to get back to that. You're right that it's sort of shifted, that there are times when the conservatives have been, because of their libertarian ideas, pro a free press. There are times Democrats, because they believe the press helps expose social injustice and all those other things, that they're in the front lines of it. I'd like to get back to where everybody's on the front line.
Trump has stacked the courts, done a very effective job stacking the courts. Is that something you worry about with all these conservative judges in the judicial that would be, go after newspapers, make your job more difficult?
Misguided optimism, number 7. No. The reason for that is that the conservative justices on the Supreme Court have been huge supporters of free expression now in the way that many people disagree with because of campaign finance and other things. But they are at heart libertarian conservatives. And I think a lot of those people coming in are as well. I also think that they are more likely, just because of conservative judicial philosophy, to stand by decisions that have been settled. And the law in this area has been settled for a really long time. So I don't see them running away from it. Now, one of the things I talk about in the book is that one of the reasons that I think we have such an incredible record of winning libel suits is because we are perceived over time as hardworking, care about the truth, getting it right, and that carries the day. That gives you the benefit of the doubt many times in a court case. We're still doing that. The work that was being done now is really incredible, not just by the Times, Washington Post, and others, but credible. I do worry about judges who, having heard fake news for the 370th time this year, think, well, maybe they are making it
Or
up.
juries.
And juries are even worse. I mean, juries have historically not liked libel cases. That is, they haven't liked our cases in libel, our side of the argument libel cases. Appeals courts have often had to come in. Judges have often had to come in to explain the law, because it's counterintuitive that the law in the United States is that we have the right to be wrong. That's what actual malice is. It's not enough in a libel case for the plaintiff to prove that we're wrong. Plaintiff has to prove that we knew it was false when we published it, or had serious doubts about it and published it anyway. That's actual malice. That is hard for most citizens who see somebody who says, my reputation was ruined and all these terrible things happened, and they may have. Still not enough. You have to prove not only that it's wrong and reputation was hurt, but you also have to prove that it was done with actual malice. Very high standard. Juries sometimes struggle with that.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about the decision to report on the allegations against Harvey Weinstein, and in particular, the learning that the reporters who were reporting on that were being investigated by a company that, if I remember correctly, had been retained by the law firm that also represented the New York Times as well as Harvey Weinstein?
Boy, there's my favorite topic. I thought I talked you out of not doing this one. What's the next question? What's your next question? Okay. So let me try to do that in simple terms. That very proud of the work that was done by Mike Schmidt and his reporting partner, Emily Steele, on Bill O'Reilly. Very, very proud of the work that was done by Megan Toohey and Jody Cantor on Harvey Weinstein. They were pioneers. And I was involved in both of those stories because there was a legal assault, if you will, in terms of O'Reilly, not so much. There was more being killed by kindness by his lawyer, but by the Weinstein lawyers trying to keep us from publishing that. And to me, the decision was easy. The decision was easy because I have an incredibly supportive senior management at the New York Times. We do not settle libel cases for money in the United States, and that makes my job really easy because the answer is always no. If you sue us, you better be in for the long haul. And I think that's driven away a lot of suits. So in some ways, my job becomes simple, and that is work with reporters and make sure that I'm that second set of eyes making sure it's right, because our reporters are trained that way, and they do that just by training. What happens with on the back end is we do this great work on Harvey Weinstein. That story was so tacked down and so well done, a series of stories before it was all over. But there was this awkwardness to it because Harvey Weinstein was represented by David Boies of the Boies Schiller firm, one of America's most distinguished lawyers. And we had hired Boies Schiller, a particular partner of Boies Schiller, to help us with a very difficult libel case, and he did a phenomenal job. And just as he was winning that case for us, the libel case, it is disclosed that David Boies, working for Harvey Weinstein, had signed a contract with Black Cube, a private investigating firm, to essentially try to stop the New York Times from publishing. It was on the surface. They were going out and investigating the people who were accusing Harvey Weinstein, but there was a clause in the contract which gave them a huge bonus if they were able to stop a certain New York publisher from publishing. It was a very awkward time for me that I was suddenly caught where I'd hired the firm to represent us. At the same time, the firm was essentially had hired an investigative firm that was in certain ways trying to intimidate our reporters. And it became this really awkward moment. And I talk about in the book that the publisher, then Arthur Sulzberger, the then publisher, calls me down to his office and says, you got to fire him. You got to fire him. And I'm like, I know I got to fire him, but today is the day the case is going to be dismissed. Okay, we're just waiting for the other side to agree that, to a walkaway so the case would be over. And so even though all around me, everybody wanted that big Trump moment of seeing me say, "You're fired" to the Boyd's firm, it was more like, it's okay. And then a couple hours later, I got the necessary paperwork for the dismissal of the case. I fired the firm. I entered my own appearance into the case, filed the dismissal, and looked like I'd won the damn thing. That was pretty great. That was the only good thing that came out of that.
Thanks a lot for an interesting evening. I don't know if this is going to come out as a question or a comment.
Okay.
But so let me just start. Full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, but I've probably learned more about law as a result of this administration than I want to know.
Who knew what the emolument clause was before, right? Come on, this has been an education.
You tell me. I mean, I'm still not sure what it is. But the point is that I used to think that people in government, especially people in high government spots, had a moral code. There was a moral core that I always thought was going to succeed. And that is what made us a great democracy. This administration has taken that away from me. I feel like we've lost our moral core. And I'm not so sure that we can recover it as easily as we would like to once this era is over. But I would like to thank you and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other, media outlets who are trying to do, I think, the right thing. I mean, you make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But I'm concerned. I'm concerned for this country. And I'm concerned about the institutions of this country and the way they're being totally dismembered by this administration. And thank you.
Okay, thank you.
It was more a comment than a question.
Let me just say one thing, which is that those voters who are single issue voters, they only vote about guns or they only vote about reproductive rights. I'm a single issue person on the Trump administration. The only thing I care about is the First Amendment and freedom of the press and none of the rest. So I'm a bit of a sellout in that way. But it does concern me what the effect on, as we were talking about, the norms that govern the way the government and the White House interacts with the press. That is an important issue to me. A bit of a story. When I was writing, I took several weeks off to write this story, to write this book. It seemed like a story. To write this book, and it was a great time in my professional life. I was so happy. It was so great to write a book. To get out of the churning that is my life each and every day as a lawyer. And if any of you have written a book, you may have had this experience. The one voice you hear every day over and over with, you think is so great. You agree with everything that voice has to say. It's that voice in your head, and it's so funny and so witty. You love that. So I was feeling really happy. And I wrote the book, and then I went back to work. And about 3 days at being back at work, I was back being the cranky, unhappy, stressed out person I'd always been. And when I went to then read the book again, it was too upbeat. And so I actually went back and darkened it in places because I just felt that once I was back on the job and things had been happening, that it needed to be a little more serious in places. And so I actually, at the end of the introduction, I say that don't be fooled by the tone of this. Bad things are happening to democracy.
Last question.
Well, thank you. Great conversation. So you spoke in between about the confusion that exists about protecting sources and that editors have now gone to jail. But I recall there was a New York Times reporter, Judith Murditt, who actually spent quite a bit of time in jail out here for refusing to release her sources for the WMD deception. And I remember another reporter at that time, Cooper, had to actually reveal some sources. Yeah. What kind of, I guess...
and thank you for doing that, because it's really worth clarifying that editors and journalists have not gone to jail for publishing. They've not been, as you would see in other countries, that they have offended the government, they get arrested for what they've said. There are incidents that and you've mentioned a couple, where reporters, to protect their sources, have refused to abide by court orders to reveal those sources, and as a result of that, they then have been put in jail to try to force them to name their sources. It comes up every so often. If you sort of think back, there's sort of been there was a big one in the 70s. There's a big one in the 80s, kind of every 10 years or 15 years or so. Serious problem though, but it's and even now when there are these leak investigations and they're not coming to me, they're not asking the New York Times to reveal sources or the Washington Post to reveal sources, it's still a very, very detrimental thing for journalism when people inside government who provide information to reporters are then pursued. It has the same effect, right? It has exactly the same effect because it cuts off the willingness of people to come forward if they see that you're risking going to jail. And I think that has been one of the worst developments, started in the Obama administration, carried forward with Trump.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.